County in far northern California, a land where we venerate trees, and speaking of trees that are regarded as sacred and much visited and special in various ways, we're home to the world's tallest tree, which I was trying to remember, I think it's named Hyperion. I supposedly came close to it, but I don't believe that's possible because it's in a rather hidden location. But it's quite incredible and also super old. These trees are fabulous. So to proceed to my own talk. Arabian coffee first reached France in the mid-17th century as a peculiar novelty which appealed mostly to early adopters curious about the effects of this new drug. By 1700, coffee had grown in popularity to the point where it was now the favorite beverage for French connoisseurs of the exotic. However, the absence of a French presence in Yemen, the sole source of production, kept coffee beans in the class of expensive luxuries, unlike in England or Holland, where a cup would cost only a penny. Coffee's very fashionableness encouraged people to speculate about ways to deliver it more cheaply to France. At this time, all coffee reached France through foreign middlemen, Muslim merchants in Cairo, Hindus in Surat, or Dutch in Amsterdam. The ideal would be to plant coffee in French colonies. In the year 1700, this was a dream, but within a mere 15 years, everything would change. Today's brief talk is drawn from my book project on the French adoption of coffee, specifically from a chapter on the first French attempts to gain some modicum of control over its production. In 1712, two doctors who were part of an early French expedition to buy coffee at the source were able to visit Yemeni coffee plantations. They seized this chance to engage in scientific service to France by learning how coffee was cultivated in Yemen. Upon their return home in 1713, journalist Jean de Varroc transformed their observations into a short guide for growing coffee, the first written down in any language, which he incorporated into his book about the expedition, The Voyage de l'Arabie Heureuse of 1715. And I should say as an aside, he published it first in 1715, but the copy I'm using for images was published a year later in 1716, thus the minor discrepancy here. But I'm going to insist on that original publication date. In an astonishing coincidence, in 1714, Professor of Botany Antoine de Jussieu of the Jardin du Roi in Paris was gifted 2 coffee trees from colleagues in Amsterdam. These were the first live coffee plants ever to arrive in France. Like the expedition doctors, Jussieu immediately recognized the potential value to the future of France's colonies to be had through studying the nature of the coffee plant. So if we back up a moment, in the 17th century, French treatises on coffee sometimes included illustrations of a coffee branch, as in these 2 examples. But these are completely illusory. No Frenchman had seen a living coffee tree, as none had been to Yemen. Thus, they had no real knowledge of how coffee actually grew or what it looked like. This knowledge gap explains why surgeons Barbier and Desnoyers were so excited when, in 1712, they became the first Frenchmen to visit the interior of Yemen by special invitation of the ruling imam. When they made the trek inland from Mocha to Moab, they marveled at what they saw. Hidden behind Yemen's arid desert coast, the temperate interior contained terraced mountainsides planted with, quote, exceptionally beautiful coffee trees, end quote, forming magnificent vistas of endless, curving green steppes. Now, this is an exceptional image, but probably what they mostly saw looked more like this. So, still really interesting, but less glamorous. Many of the plantations they saw were small peasant properties. Some of them, though, were sizable private plantations. And even the imam himself proudly maintained a, quote, personal garden of the most superior coffee trees, end quote, in a setting that would have looked much like this. And in addition to the terraces here, it's a little hard to make out, but here is a mountaintop village, which looks probably a great deal like the citadel where the imam maintained his main residence. While they were visiting the imam, here's what they learned. They learned that coffee trees flower multiple times per year, and thus there are several harvests. They observed how the Yemenis used controlled irrigation systems to optimize the tree's fruit production across the year. And most interestingly, as this slide shows, they witnessed shade-grown coffee, a method for protecting delicate trees from the hot sun, which is still widely used today among fair trade coffee farmers. These surgeons gathered this information, not for themselves, but rather with an intention of harnessing their curiosity to serve France as agricultural agents of empire. They also carried home to France a coffee tree branch loaded with fruits and trees, as illustrated on the right. In 1713, a report by these men reached botanist Antoine de Jussieu at the Jardin du Roi. He was pleased at first, but when, quite unexpectedly the following year, he received a living coffee tree sent from Amsterdam to Paris, he set aside the surgeon's account as, quote, highly imperfect, and he determined to let the plant teach him by watching it grow, flower, and fruit before his eyes. This, quote, scrupulous examination from nature, end quote, persuaded him to classify it with the jasmines. He also discovered that it was remarkably easy to propagate from seed within the protected confines of a greenhouse. His goal was to acclimate coffee to France. And he wrote, these trees have become quite common in Holland. This is what he reported to the Royal Academy of Sciences. One hopes that soon they will also spread in France, he continued, and thrive even better because France's climate is more temperate and seeds of these trees grow very quickly. Through these two accounts, we can see how the earliest French encounters with coffee trees were filtered through the twin lenses of agricultural and botanical science. In Yemen, the surgeon explorers interviewed commercial farmers about coffee's preferences for water, shade, and altitude, and they also noted Yemeni customs for harvesting and for processing it for sale. In Paris, Jussieu studied the plant directly to see what answers it might yield about itself. What were its leaves, flowers, and seeds like? How did it propagate and grow? Most importantly, could it successfully acclimate to conditions outside Yemen? So what I've told you so far, I should also say this is a very brief talk, but I'm happy to take questions on all sorts of stuff once we're into the roundtable part of this session. What I've told you so far, these are stories about human agency. This is pretty standard stuff for historians to talk about. But in keeping with telling new stories in new ways, I would like to ask what happens if we make coffee a central actor in this history. Sidney Mintz famously argued in his History of Sugar that the seemingly trivial and non-historical taste for sweetness played a significant role in pushing such major socio-economic developments as the rise of capitalist merchant empires, the emergence of Caribbean plantation economies, and the Industrial Revolution. I see the desire for caffeinated stimulants, specifically coffee, possessing similar propulsive powers and contributing significantly to the same outcomes. But to achieve these effects, I propose we should first consider the initial causal attractions that pulled people toward coffee. Coffee drew French explorers to Yemen, and coffee prompted Jussieu to set aside his other projects in order to present his discoveries to the Académie Royale des Sciences. The excitement surrounding coffee prompted Larocque to write his account of the first French expeditions to the fabled markets of Mocha. Coming full circle, Larocque concluded his narrative with a personal visit to Jussieu's plant in the Paris Botanical Garden. And both men separately published the first accurate illustrations shown here of coffee plants within 1 year of each other. Larocque in 1715, Jussieu in 1716. Now, there's clearly a profit motive at stake. All these men understood coffee had the potential to expand the fortunes of France's nascent empire. But did coffee in turn use them as a way to extend its reach across the globe? Okay, you're laughing. This sounds a little silly. How can coffee plants have agency, right? Yet, the desire at the core of this profit potential stems from a property inherent to the plant itself, the caffeine present in its seeds, right? I think we can safely presume that coffee evolved this chemical as an attractant to get animals to eat its fruit and thus spread its genes. This shifted perspective is inspired by the emerging fields of cultural plant studies and plant humanities, pioneered respectively by literary scholar Joella Jacobs in 2016 and historian Jutta Batzaki in 2018. Their essential idea asks us to consider plant-human interactions and relations between humans and plants from a plant-centered position that is also grounded in humanistic inquiry. Plants have their own goals, and making themselves uniquely attractive to us humans improves their success at the most fundamental point of life, reproducing and spreading their genes as widely as possible. Coffee's special attraction to animals, not just French people, nor even just humans, lies of course in its stimulant properties, which had already resulted in it being carried across the Red Sea from Ethiopia to Yemen and even as far as India. I should probably have made that go the other direction because you're facing the opposite way from me. But it really hit the reproductive jackpot when a number of Europeans, of whom the most energetic turned out to be Frenchmen, decided to invest their energies in assisting it to become a truly global phenomenon. I've long argued that in the process of domesticating coffee, not just as a drink to consume, but also as a commodity to produce, the French sought to transform a foreign plant into one imbued with a French identity. But I've come to think that coffee is also an actor in this history. Adopting coffee wound up altering French identity by turning a wine-drinking culture into a culture also centered on caffeine. Moreover, and thanks largely to French initiatives, coffee plants suddenly had an opportunity to expand far beyond the Red Sea and Arabian Sea littorals to try their luck in other vastly different distant parts of the globe, where it turns out they could also thrive. Today, we call this zone that rings the planet the coffee belt. Within the tropical latitudes, it traces a path, I'll go the right way this time, from Arabia to India to Southeast Asia to Indonesia, let's go around the globe, to Hawaii, to Mesoamerica, the Caribbean, Latin America, and finally back to its point of origin in the Horn of Africa. Taking this view, what I have until now been calling a French project to underwrite the growth of its empire, in part through expanding coffee production, starts to seem instead like a coffee project to manipulate human interest in its stimulating properties to carry it to more and more points around the planet. That the humans happen to be French is a random detail from the plant's perspective. However, from the human perspective, the adoption of coffee by the people of France was tremendously consequential and transformative for better and for worse. Metropolitan demand for coffee beans pushed French merchants to tap markets previously out of reach, such as in Yemen. Metropolitan scientists established botanical and agricultural knowledge about this new plant and created a plantation model focused on coffee to wring profits from ever more colonies, starting with the Ile de Bourbon, modern Reunion, in the Indian Ocean in 1715, then continuing along a range of Caribbean islands and French Guiana through the mid-18th century. Alongside sugar, coffee caused a horrific upsurge in the number of Africans enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic to labor in these new plantations, most notably and famously in Saint-Domingue. Following the Haitian Revolution, that French expertise in coffee cultivation was soon carried by exiles to rival economies, opening the door to the 19th century coffee industries of Cuba, Jamaica, and South America. While France is widely credited with creating modern cafe culture, few are aware that the French played such a significant role in initially spreading coffee cultivation around the world. When the French discovered coffee between 1712 and 1716, that is, when they first gained access to living plants to study and experiment upon, who really benefited? The French, who applied this knowledge to expand and fund their first global empire partly on profits from coffee? Or the coffee plants, which, by generating excitement and fascination among a group of useful humans, eventually gained a global empire of their own. Thank you.
Who would like to begin? would you just like to go seriatim and each ask questions of the other? Perhaps. You want to do that?
Well, I'll just, I want to talk to you closely here. I'll just start with a brief comment, something that you said toward the end of your talk. When you said that empire building meant knowledge gathering, I think you were, that was maybe a line from the show, or a line from yourself?
An
Analysis of the show. Yeah, because I was like, that jumped right out of me, because it's exactly what I was thinking of, that you have to gather knowledge in order to lay the groundwork for everything involved in building a profitable empire, which is also what we're talking about. So I just liked that. So I thought I'd just throw that out there again.
Thank you. Yes, I think the economic aspect of this is central, of course, to all three of our papers, but all three of them also speak to something cultural that is driving the consumption of these goods, whether it is fashion, whether it is curiosity about the science, whether it is some sort of veneration of this knowledge gathering and expertise that they're creating that contributes to the allure of the French produced drink, dye, that contributes to the making of fashion. I think this is key here.
Right, and just to build up on that, the centers of knowledge gathering are in some ways so diffused, but also centralized.
Well, this is that story of networks, right? And connecting metropolitan colony and metropolitan and explorers also, right? And across the oceans. Do you want to ask
Please speak in the mic.
Hi, I'm Leanne Vardy, University at Buffalo. I have a question for Beth, and I would like to know why it is so difficult to find investors in various kinds of tropical trees. We know that Malzerbe, for example, was fanatic in his collection of trees, and that's only, in a sense, accidental because stuff has been written about it. But in biographies of Malzerbe, you won't find that kind of information. So how would one go about figuring out which nobles actually invested, as opposed to botanical gardens and royal collections?
So in terms of investing in tropical trees, investing in them, I can't directly answer that question, but what we do know are we do know the networks through which the French nobles are acquiring their tropical and specifically American specimens. And thanks to the surviving inventories of all of the plants that were seized from the gardens of the nobles in the wake of, basically in 1692, 1693, we know everything that was inventoried in those gardens, and everything was seized and taken to the Jardin des Plantes. They are, many of them, just starting my analysis of them, many of them are described, contain the descriptor of where they came from. So if they're distinguished as an American specimen, or sometimes even more specific, something from Virginia, something from the Carolinas, and so forth. So it is possible to at least figure out the kinds of foreign or colonial plants that are being brought into French gardens. Investing in them is a harder question for me to answer, but I do know that the French, especially in this phase, and I was painting with broad brushstrokes today in order to get in our 10 minutes, there's so much more detail into the machinations of what was taking place. place during the American Revolution and the immediate years after, that the French are negotiating essentially trade deals with the Americans that included specifically trees and seeds and plants, because they wanted to make sure that they could flow as easily, that they eliminated trade barriers essentially to facilitate the flow of those goods.
Thanks, I'm Catherine Clark, I teach at MIT. I really love these papers, and I have a question about object-oriented ontologies, kind of plants-oriented ontologies. So, Julia, I love the way you reframed this, and I'm wondering about which plants can manage to make their own empires. Is there something like about thinking about your oak trees? I'm like indigo. I don't know like how long it takes to grow, but like oaks take forever to grow, right? And so like are these American oaks like incapable of forming their own empires because they're not actually coffee plants, but like I don't know, 20 years and you get something really producible and thriving, right? So like, can we start to think about if we think about like the American Empire versus the British Empire versus, you know, like, can we start to think about like the way the plant empires are different? And I'm thinking about all the Chinese plants that are like ornamental gardens are full of Chinese plants, right? So like, actually, are we living in a plant imperial world that is like not dominated by any of the places we study, and rather, you know, should we be at like Asian studies conferences thinking about camellias and stuff, right? So that is a kind of very broad question, but thank you so much for these.
And lots of ways to get at that question that you raised with regard to thinking about empires of oak. There are, of course, always commented on how long it takes for an oak to grow, and of course, the descriptions, the very technical descriptions about how to manage a forest talk about the time frame that is involved, but never in Michaud's mission did any of his superiors really address the fact that this is a decades forward project. Michaud himself understood, he actually touted his expertise in the way that all of our botanists are touting their expertise by observing the plant in its location, in its own environment, but also observing it growing. So Michaud touted the fact that not only was he collecting the acorns and the leaves, but he would plant them in his nursery gardens and watch them grow, and therefore he could be sure of identifying it based on the changes in the leaf shape as the plant matured, and then was able to tout upon publishing his volume that there were specimens in Rambouillet that were by this time almost a decade old. So he's not far enough to build a ship, obviously, but there are these interesting slippages, places where time comes in, places where time slips out.
And I just want to thank you, Catherine. I think that I agree with you. And in fact, when so I'm totally new to plant studies, plant humanities. In fact, I owe it all to Beth, who introduced me to the concept, and I was like, that's very cool. And when I thought about turning this around from the point of view of coffee and coffee growing its own empire, I then promptly thought, well, you could say that about crop plants, particularly all the major domesticates. You could say about wheat and corn, potatoes, and coffee, or excuse me, obviously, chocolate, cacao, sugar cane, anything that has really captured our interest. We are now devoting an enormous amount of the planet's resources, land resources, to helping it do its thing. So yeah, it's probably, this is a world that unfortunately we're coming to dominate too much, but we should have more respect for all these other living beings that have their own needs, and recognize that they may be using us as well.
The question here.
Hi, Dina Goodman, University of Michigan. It's a great panel, and I also was kind of inspired by Julia's notion of coffee's empire over us, which clearly is completely dominant, that we are totally subjected to coffee. But I also thought about taking that kind of paradigm and thinking about you're looking at indigo, and what seems to be interesting was the similarity here, and what's different from Beth's oaks is that indigo and coffee will not grow in Europe. or they can't be cultivated commercially.
And not naturally, they need like greenhouses and special conditions.
Right, and yeah, so
They need
they,
a lot of
and,
help.
you know, there's this whole thing about like Linnaeus kept trying to grow tea in Sweden, and he kept trying to bring tea plants back, they kept dying, and he just didn't really accept that it wasn't possible. He just sort of thought you should be, if you just took care of it properly and got it over to Europe, you could grow it, rather than that there are climactic conditions necessary for the successful cultivation plant. So it does seem to me interesting to think about these, if you think about the expansion of the empire, the way it also is important is because when Europeans, and I guess I'm wondering when this happens, when Europeans realize they cannot cultivate these things they crave in Europe, and so therefore they need an empire to do it. And that facilitates the empire of indigo and coffee, because it propels Europeans to appropriate lands in climates that are conducive to the things they want to have. And so instead of like conquering Yemen, they find other places they can take the coffee to, or they can take the indigo to. So they never really are very successful conquering India, but they get that indigo out of there and find someplace else they can conquer. So I guess I'm interested in what that dynamic is in how Europeans think about creating empire
That's a great
in
question.
order to facilitate the production of things that they want that will not grow in Europe. So they can't just take the commodity, but they also can't just conquer the place where the commodity is grown. So there's a third location and the implications for that location. Like when does that start happening? And because, yeah.
Well, I guess you're making me think about something none of the three of us talked about, but is, I think, implicated in everything we're discussing, is this, the 18th century is also a period in which would-be scientists and also planters and colonists are all talking amongst themselves about climatic zone, right? The science of climate and the science of ecological zones. And I find this repeatedly in the early attempts to figure out where they can take coffee, is there's all this debate about, okay, Bourbon or Réunion it's just like Yemen, therefore coffee will thrive there. Or French Guiana, it's exactly the same latitude as Yemen, therefore coffee will thrive there. Not totally understanding all the other variables that go into this. But when it worked, which it did in both of those places, they felt that their scientific assumptions were correct. So it's definitely happening.
You should do what I answered also.
Great question. The third location, yes, it's locations, right? So at least in the case of indigo, the Portuguese take it to Brazil and try to grow it there. The French do it in the Caribbean, and it starts, as long as I know, as early as the 16th century, and sort of takes off in the 17th and 18th. But as the empires then are in competition because of the price that comes down, because the British managed to grow indigo much cheaper in the land reforms that they introduced, and that sort of destroys land in Gulf and causes famine for like 19th century. So I don't know how to answer that, but it gives me a lot of questions to think through what's happening regarding this third location.
Wait, did you want to add to that? And do we have a question here? And then I see another one. Did you want to answer that?
I was just very briefly, amazing question, important for us to think about, and you see Michaud doing exactly that as he moves around the United States, looking at which zone is going to produce plants that will be suitable for which parts of France. But some of the contemporary modern botanists that I've been looking at on oak are saying that oak is one of the trees that is found all over the world, one of the most successful specimens, precisely because it doesn't have terribly specific requirements. There are different varieties that of course grow well in wet areas or in open areas or in dense areas, and that has resulted in that variation. But if you want to think about the agency, the botanical agency of the plant, it has very few requirements and therefore is all the more valuable in a different context.
But is that true, or is that like the invisibility of white privilege? In other words, it's a temperate climate, it's a European climate, so they say it's nothing special, it's just natural and normal. I mean, I suppose you can't grow oaks in like the tropics.
Not in
right?
the tropics, but it is, there are varieties of oaks that thrive in southeastern United States,
Yeah.
and varieties of oaks that, so within
A large area.
a larger area
Right.
than one would find in a lot of other
But
specimens.
it's not
Well,
universal.
I'm sorry.
Not
We have
universal.
another question here. so
Yeah.
I'm gonna pass it on. Go ahead.
No, actually, I also had a question. It started off as a question about the oaks, but it might actually work for all of the plants that you're discussing. And just this idea of I think you used an expression like the forest heritage, or like in my head, I was hearing patrimoine forestiers, this French, very French techniques for maintaining the forest. And so in that, in this idea of the well-maintained forest, then there's a domination of sort of the life cycle of the plant, from planting to growing to harvesting, and the harvesting itself is managed. And then there's also, you mentioned, this certain trees that become sacred or venerated. And so when you showed the image of the sentinel oak, that I guess it kind of flipped from one side to another because it was planted as one of Colbert's sort of managed forests, and now it's this individual subject that's admired. And I was just wondering if you could, and so in general, like this at what point you go from like this general management in which like one individual subject doesn't matter very much, or like one individual indigo plant, like when it's the first indigo plant or the first coffee plant to make it, to like, and then it's this precious object or this precious living thing, then all of a sudden we have these vast resources that one individual isn't, and then there's others that kind of become venerated, and just I'm thinking about like that. How does that like how does it flip from one to many to one, and maybe if I'm gonna ask for a comment. Like, does that bring any other?
With regard to the sentinel tree, I think it in fact has, I don't mean to keep anthropomorphizing these trees, but a foot in both worlds. It is venerated, it is venerated as an example of the success of this cultivation plan. So it's there not in a different, its veneration is stemming from this French manipulation of its environment, as opposed to being venerated for a particularly Christian connection or some other piece. So I see it living in both of those ecosystems, as it were. But I think that larger cycle that you're talking about is connected to cycles of geopolitical dominance, cycles in the economy, cycles of fashion and taste.
So coffee is the exact opposite of oaks, because coffee trees only live about 20 years and then they die. They start producing beans around the age of 4 to 6 years old, and then they last maybe 20 years if you're lucky. So they don't last long enough to be venerated. They're a commodity in true commodity sense. But you raise a marvelous point, because these first ones that managed to get acclimated, moved across vast regions and acclimated, were venerated. So Jussieu's example that he was gifted from the Dutch becomes this object of veneration by Baroque. And then it is the progenitor of the first. There's a whole mythologizing that goes around a sapling that Jussieu gave to a lieutenant who carried it at great personal risk across the Atlantic and planted it in Martinique, and supposedly that single sapling that traces its heritage to that single tree that Jussieu started with, the sapling that this guy Clio carries, is supposedly the ancestor of every coffee tree in the Americas, which is a total fantasy, not at all true. But you can visit in Martinique a tree that is supposedly like descended from that tree, and people worship it. It's all a myth. Doesn't exist.
It's a meaningful,
Sorry, I have to ask to everybody. So
If she has a follow-up, I have no
Oh,
problem
you
with
have
that.
a
But did you have something else?
No, I just wanted to add that the veneration of indigo comes from its usefulness as a tie and as a commodity. And then the tissue was very much in demand in the court from the 17th, 16th century, and first came to the Portuguese route. But there's no veneration like of the oak tree. There's no religious functions attended to it. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, so I'm Mary Lewis from Harvard. I was thinking, I mean, especially after Dina asked her question, a little bit more about this ontology of the plant stuff. And I find myself a little discomfited by it. It seems, and I guess I just sort of want to get your reactions. It seems as though there's a difference between the Norway maples that land in my yard and take over, you know, if I don't weed it,
Yeah.
and a plant like coffee or indigo that depends on enslaved labor to both cultivate it and then turn it into the commodity that it becomes. And so I guess I'm just wondering, I'm thinking about, you know, Marin had this nice point, the term phrase, political ecology. But I was thinking, well, why ecology rather than economy? And, you know, maybe these things are so tied up in one another that we can't really separate them. But it did seem like oaks were a little bit different of a species, if you will, or, you know, and I guess I'm just inviting, I don't really have a well-articulated question here, but inviting a reflection on the way in which, you know, plant empire is dependent on a kind of labor exploitation that you didn't ignore, but that you didn't put front and center, I guess. And so I just wondered if you could reflect on that.
I'll just reflect really briefly in that with the history of coffee, my period between basically the 18th century is a fluke in the much longer history of coffee-human relations, in which it is actually the rare period where there is enslaved labor. Before Europeans began cultivating coffee, it was free labor, or, you know, it was people doing it in their family garden, family plots, or hiring workers. And then after when slavery ends in the early to mid 19th century, you know, in different places, different times, it reverts back to the older patterns of labor. So there are other historians who are far more versed than I am in economies of slave labor who've pointed this out. And it's really interesting that what we assume is the way it was is actually an aberration in the longer history of it.
Sorry, there's a question back there. I think everybody wants to answer, but first of all, it's Curtis, and then we have two more questions. Please go ahead.
One of the interesting pieces about Michaud's South Carolina operation, and he does claim ownership over a small number of enslaved persons. He takes an enslaved man with him back to France and then to Madagascar on his final and fatal voyage. And there's a little bit known about this person, but not very much. One of the larger economic pieces to emerge out of Michaud's botanical mission, though, was in South Carolina, when he bought the land to create his nursery garden there. He actually touted the fact that this plot of land was a small, functioning blanking on whether or not he uses the word plantation, but it was a functional agricultural space, and he essentially says, because he's always, during his mission, of course, the French Revolution breaks out, and he's struggling to get funds, initially from the royal government, and then from the Republican government, which is very skeptical of the Charleston project, saying that he basically argues, this is a functioning farm through which I'm going to be able to subsidize the botanical work that I'm doing. So it's a flip on these processes.
Lynn, did you want to address the question that was just asked?
Well, I think that's a very astute invitation to reflect, and as without being anachronistic, I think the reason the artwork by the Saint Sisters seemed important to me. Its overlays past on the present. It also brings together these content histories of different empires around this plant, and people coveting the plant, but also how it can only be turned to die through labor of the enslaved or vastly underexploited, no, I'm taking back my words, exploited and domination of the soil. Yeah, so thank you for the comment.
Thank you. We have a question here, and then gentleman in the front. I think we may be out of time. Please.
Yeah, so this is a great panel. Thanks for all of these papers. But I do want to follow up on Mary's point, because I was thinking, as we've been talking about, what the different narratives of plants and empires and animal studies, and how do they displace the humans, and decenter those narratives. But then I also wonder, is a narrative such as this, the plant ontology narrative, one that puts the emphasis on consumption and the people who are the consumers rather than the people who are the producers of the plants, or are facilitating their growth in those ways. So I was just, you've already reflected on this in many ways, but I'm just sort of wondering about, are these narratives that in some ways contribute to the invisibilizing of certain forms of labor, which is why I thought the piece that you started with, Ren, was so beautiful, especially the way the overlay between the 18th century pictures, which is also very interesting in the way those 18th century narratives, progressively abstract the labor and the discussion of plants in those narratives is the plants, there are hands and people and bodies moving these plants forward, but the specificity with which these narratives talk about those individuals gets much more abstract over the course of the 18th century as labor becomes far more widespread and the central motor of production of these plants. So it's just a thought, but one I think is worth considering as you progress with your projects. Thank you.
I think we have enough time for you to answer, and then we have one last question, so maybe the answers come from you. Which I say concise.
So one of the inspirations for the paper came from a class I taught on fashion and fast fashion, and my students pointed out the almost pandemic of fast fashion and what it does to the labor force of folks to exploit it, to manufacture it, and the health concerns. And that's why on the painting, I saw this black lungs that the artist wanted to portray, and it's sort of response to also what some of the authors in the 18th century, even though it's abstracted thinking about refuse to from the mango plantations to the lungs of the enslaved. So, thank you.
One last question.
Yes, just really quickly. The consumer was sort of suppressed in the story that I told today, but clearly they're the driving engine, because if there wasn't an interest in consuming coffee, no one would be growing it. And then, as you already said, the rising popularity of coffee and the dropping price in the metropole went along with an essential, I think, not a suppression, but simply an disinterest or lack of awareness of how this drink was produced, how the beans were produced, which is a terrible thing. I guess I'm not sure what else to say at the moment, but those are really excellent points.
Process, like sugar.
Yeah.
You use sugar, you know what it costs. Do you want to answer too, or is there
Very, very briefly,
That was the question.
while the oaks were being used for barrels and wheels and baskets, the primary motive was to acquire timber that was going to create the warships that would allow for further domination
And
of the
transatlantic,
globe.
and the transatlantic trade?
Yes.
Sir, I think you may
Hi,
have
my
a
name
question.
is Dan Simpkins. I'm a retired anthropologist, and look at this maybe a little bit different perspective in terms of coevolution of plants and animals and agricultural evolution. It caution a little about presuming that the coffee plant is trying to spread itself through attracting animals, but rather it's probably trying to attract birds to eat the aril and then pass the seed and digest it through its system. And that toxic seed is probably meant to be toxic, but it's humans' cultural kind of weird, attraction to psychotropic substances that really, maybe more, the factor for the plant to have evolved to attract a cultural practice. It's getting, maybe, stretching a little bit.
So I said animals because another classic origin story about coffee is the supposed discovery of coffee, that there was a goat herd in Ethiopia, and he one day observed his goats eating berries from bush and then being super frisky. And probably,
So the question then is whether it's only humans that do that.
Oh, no, that's why I assume that the plant doesn't care who, birds, animals, what,
Right.
who it eats it,
Right.
as long as they're interested.
But
And then
the
there's,
fact that you destroy the seed makes
Yeah.
it a little.
yeah. And there's also, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of civet coffee, which is
Yeah.
in Indonesia,
Right.
yeah, that there are
Right.
civet cats,
It's most expensive.
you're right, it's marvelous, supposedly, yes.
Yeah, very expensive.
Yes. But that's the kind of passing and spreading of the seed
Yes.
Right.
with animals, yeah.
I think we may have run out of time. I have a lot of questions. About the oaks and the way the 16th century saw the depletion and the frictions and the fights between communities and monarchy and also local lords over that. And also an interesting thing about how that worked with the existing cultivation and trading wool, which is that there were indigenous to Europe plants that did die. Of course, it's not exactly the same tint, but interesting to see how something like this place would exist there, or how it might coexist. So there were many, many more questions, and we really thank our speakers for their wonderful talk and their ability to respond to the complex questions that the audience raised. And thank you to the audience for having been so engaged and for the wonderful questions you asked.